Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to Religion and Culture. It's been a sort of a crazy, unorthodox start to the semester, and because of the snow day today, wanted to take an opportunity and give you a little video lecture, I guess, that normally would have taken place during class time today, as we think a little bit more about the importance of studying culture. But we run out of days, and I'm not sure where everything's going to fit. And so I wanted to go ahead and give this to you. The PowerPoints that correspond with this lecture are available to you on Blackboard. If you go into our Blackboard site, there's one of the tabs is about information, I believe, and under there's a sub-tab for Exam 1 PowerPoints, and under that you should find actually two PowerPoints. We'll be finishing one up today and completing the second. They're titled Studying Culture and Studying Culture 2. So cleverly titled there, but just wanting to think through some ideas today about culture and its importance and how we recognize it and the role that it plays in our lives, so that when we get back together face to face on Monday of next week, I hope, then we'll be ready to talk about religion and the importance that plays in our lives and in our societies as well. So I guess in terms of preliminaries, in case you have registered late for this class, my name is Dr. Eddie Stepp, and glad that you're in here. I have been fighting off sickness from the time that we met last week, and while it's better, it has certainly not cured itself all the way. And so if there are little bits and pieces of coughing or anything of that going on today, my apologies in advance. I'll try to keep it under wraps as much as possible, but trying to get the voice back used to talking and being with y'all sometimes takes a little time to get everything back up and running. So anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed your day and a little day off, that you've been safe and had fun, and maybe you can work in this video a little bit at your leisure while you're under a blanket or something this afternoon or this evening, and at least hopefully before we come to class on Monday. This lecture does stand in place of what we would have done in class, and so are you responsible for it? Yes. Will this material be on an exam? Yes. And as I mentioned before, there are the PowerPoints that go along with this, so you can pull those up and follow along. But you'll also notice in your PowerPoints that there are some blanks, some keywords that I will give you along the way and invite you to fill in. And that is information that you will need as well. So I hope that you will take an opportunity to listen to this and pick up the information that's necessary, that we'll need for moving forward. So thinking today, I guess at the end of class last time we talked a little bit about, at least from my perspective, the importance of this class and why we do what we do, the value of this class, both personally and culturally, as we think about other people and the diversity that surrounds us, those sorts of things. And sort of picking up that first PowerPoint, the Studying Culture PowerPoint, we had looked at those first couple of slides together. Moving on in that PowerPoint, the second Roman numeral wants us to look at the definition of culture, and what do we mean by culture. Defining our terms, I think, is an important thing to do. So this is sort of my attempt to offer two different definitions that I think are complementary in some ways. The second one's a little more fun, I guess, but the first one's a little more technical. So the definition one, this is the totality of beliefs and values, worldview, and behavior. Now, this is an attempt to try to say everything that we learn, everything that we experience is part of the culture that shapes our lives. So the totality of beliefs, values, worldview, and behavior. Everything that we experience, everything that sort of comes upon us, it's of a particular group. It's transmitted from one generation to the next. And so this opens up all sorts of things for us to consider. Is there an American culture that sort of fits within this definition? Yeah, I think that there is. But I think family units provide their own culture. Groups that you're a part of, organizations that you're a part of, places that you work. Workplaces will often talk about a particular workplace culture, attitudes and values that they want their employees to have and to share, so that there is a sense, I think, in which we all have multiple little subcultures, different cultures along the way that make up who we are. Things that we learn are important. Things that we learn to do. Things that we learn to express. Things we learn to value. Beliefs that we share within particular groups. This could be the church. This could be military. This could be sports team. This could be a variety of different things that has this unique culture that we find ourselves a part of, and we learn, and we become a part of this, and we learn the do's and the don'ts, and all of that sort of shapes up these individual cultures that we're a part of. So that's the fancy definition. Definition number 2 that I have here on the slide. Definition number 2 is culture can be defined as the way we do things around here. The way we do things around here. If you've ever had somebody sort of join your group and they don't quite understand what's going on, it's because they have not been exposed to your culture before. And so that's why I think oftentimes in our groups, when we accept new members into the group, whatever group, again, that may be, we have ways of helping people adjust to new groups, to campus life, to Gardner Webb. There are ways of bringing in new students so that they get a sense of the culture of Gardner Webb and expectations and all those sorts of things that can be true in a variety of other places as well. So the way we do things around here, and if you didn't grow up in this area and you came to Boiling Springs, there may have been this sense of, wow, people do it around here differently than we did back home. Well, that's because there's sort of a regional culture. There's a southern culture. There's small town culture. There's a distinctive Boiling Springs culture that, especially if you are from another place, learning to adjust can be challenging sometimes. That's why I include the language down here of culture shock, because as we move from one culture to another, oftentimes this sense of dislocation, of displacement, as we move from one culture to another, can sort of shock our system, because this is the way that we're used to doing things. People talk differently. People act differently. Why are people smiling at me? Why are people so friendly? What are they eating? What's going on? And all of those sorts of things, as we learn to adjust, and we're adjusting to new roommates and a new place of living, and all those sorts of things, we're becoming part of a new culture, and sometimes that can be a difficult and disorienting sort of thing. And so I think culture shock is a very real thing. if I remember correctly from our conversations last week, most of you are from the Tar Heel State. But if you've traveled internationally before, for example, that's really where we have a tendency to experience even more culture shock. When your language is taken away from you, when everything is new, new can be exciting, but new can have its negative effects on us as well, because we don't understand what's going on around us. We may not know how to get from point A to point B. The new smells that are around us can be problematic. The foods that we are asked to eat sometimes can be problematic. There's so much going on that's different that we're not used to. Can be challenging for people who travel and who cross those cultural boundaries. And I think we should be aware that that's the case for people who come into American culture, for example, and maybe our need to be a little more sympathetic with those who are experiencing American culture for the first time and helping them along the process of adapting to culture in ways that are helpful and beneficial, because it's a difficult and a challenging process, because culture takes in so much, as we'll see here below in just a minute. The next slide, Roman numeral 3, takes us to some observations about culture itself. And just a couple of things that I want us to think about for a minute. Things that I've thought about is as I've pondered the relationship between culture and religion in particular, and perhaps just some other things that we can think about. The first observation that I brought is that religion and culture have a symbiotic relationship. Sorry, I don't have the board here in front of me today to be able to write this on the board. Symbiotic is SYMBIOTIC. Symbiotic relationship, which means it simply means that the effect between religion and culture goes both ways. Culture always has its shaping influence on religion and religious institutions, and the reverse of that is also true. Religion, its teachings, its beliefs, its values, its voice, always is having some sort of impact on culture. To what degree is going to vary significantly. An example of this, we could talk about several examples, and we will throughout the semester, because this is one of the things that we'll see when we look at even religion in other cultures as well. But just thinking about one that's sort of close to home is the celebration of Christmas in America. Religious holiday, absolutely. That's why it initially found its way onto the calendar back when it did. The way that Christmas gets celebrated now by the vast majority of Americans, I think, speaks to the role that culture has played in shaping religious practice and ideas and values, and how do we merge together sort of this gift-giving extravaganza along with the religious element and the religious teaching that many want to include in Christmas, and where's that balance? And you've got the consumerism, and you've got the pious practice of this important celebration, and what does that look like? And I think we see both the religious influencing the culture, but the culture influencing the religious as well. And so it's interesting to think about those sorts of things. The next observation that I've offered for you there, I would argue, and I think lots of people argue, that culture is learned. Culture is not a biological instinct, but that culture is something that we learn by being a part of the culture or the particular subculture that we're a part of. It's interesting the way that culture sort of shapes our influences about some of these sorts of things. If you were to think about the floor, is the floor clean or dirty? I think most of us in America, our default reaction is the floor is dirty. That's why we come up with things like the 5-second rule. If we drop a piece of food, especially if it's something that we value highly, we scramble quickly down and whatever, blow it off. Oh, 5-second rule, ha ha ha, and we're still free to eat it because we know that the floor is dirty. If we ask somebody in Japan, is the floor clean or dirty? Culturally, their response is going to be very different. Now, part of the reason is in Japan, people don't wear shoes in their house. They're meticulous about keeping the floor clean because you sit on the floor. You sit on the floor to eat. In cultures where that is the case, there is a different view of cleanliness. If we took all the tables out of the cafeteria and said, okay, we're all sitting on the floor and eating today, most of us are probably grabbing our to-go containers and getting out of there. It's something that we learn. It's not a biological sort of thing. We learn through eating dirt, and we learn through parental correction that, okay, this is not something that we do in our culture, even though others in other cultures may not have the same issue. Raise the question as just another example. Should men who are friends hold hands? American culture, that's typically not something that goes on. Even women in our culture who are simply friends sometimes might hold hands, but that's not something that you see very often. But in other cultures around the world, both male and female, you would see that's very different. In African cultures, it's very common for men who are friends to hold hands. In various cultures, both Asian, European, others, women holding hands is not out of the ordinary. And so it's interesting how we think about those things and feel about those things based on our cultural upbringing, whereas in other places that's not a big deal. And I guess those are sorts of things that you should be aware of if you are traveling in another culture and somebody comes up and grabs your hand as you're walking down the street, so that you can be prepared to respond accordingly. Example number 3 that I've mentioned here, is it bad to be left-handed? Nothing against left-handed people among us. It's not a big thing in American society to be left-handed, but in other cultures around the world, it is a bad thing to be left-handed. And in fact, children are trained from an early age not to be left-handed, because in some cultures the left hand is considered the dirty hand. The right hand is the hand that you eat with, that you greet with. The left hand is for dirtier sorts of duties, and so being left-handed would be almost forbidden in other cultures. And so it's interesting, again, just sort of how cultural perception shapes things that we might not ordinarily think about. sort of the big word for this, sort of the fancy word, if you will, is the word enculturation. Enculturation is the process of social interaction through which people learn their culture. It's a process. From the time that we are young, we are learning our culture. And hopefully we have people along the way who are helping us well to learn our culture and to learn how to adapt in certain situations, what's right, what's not right, what's acceptable, what's forbidden, all those sorts of things we are learning. That's part of childhood. That's part of exploration and boundaries and all those sorts of things. So it is a process through which people learn their culture, which is why I had friends in West Virginia, lived in West Virginia for a long time. They adopted 2 girls from China. They kept them exposed to their Chinese culture, but they were also thoroughly immersed in West Virginia culture in all of its glory, if you will. You see them and you think, you're not from around here, but if you close your eyes and you heard them talk and heard them carry on and heard their conversations and all those different sorts of things, they had been enculturated significantly by picking up the language and accents and other sorts of cultural traits that would have been a significant part of their communities. So it's interesting to see how that works. Lastly, here I mentioned that we learn our culture in a couple of different ways, primarily through trial and error and through observation. We learn by doing. We do something. It apparently is okay. We realize that, okay, we can do this again and it is socially acceptable. We do something and it fails. We receive correction. We hopefully, most well-adjusted people will sort of alter their plan and adjust accordingly. We also sort of do this through observing others. If you're a younger sibling, you may have watched very closely older siblings to see what they do, how they act and speak, and what they get away with, and sometimes there is advantage to being the younger child in that sense. But we watch others. We pick up on social cues. Most of us do. That's my dog Tucker in the background. Probably somebody else is walking their dog down the sidewalk, which sometimes he doesn't appreciate. So hopefully he'll stop in a minute. And if not, you'll see an uncomfortable situation of me dealing with the dog in a minute. So anyway, trial and error, observation are the 2 main ways that the process of enculturation takes place. A couple final things on this PowerPoint, and then we'll move quickly through the other one. A couple of other observations about culture. Essentially, I know that we've given a definition, but what all is included when you think about culture? I mean, earlier we talked about beliefs and values and worldview and behavior, which is sort of not very concrete, I guess. So what is it that really makes up culture? If you read the PDF document related to culture that was sort of a part of the class assignment for today, you would have come across this language of explicit culture and implicit culture, sort of different levels at which we can see and recognize manifestations of culture. So explicit culture are those that are most readily observable aspects of culture. And I've mentioned a number of things here, and there are lots of other things that are mentioned in the reading as well. The political system that we grow up in shapes our culture. The economic system that we grow up in shapes our culture individually. I mean, if we grow up in a capitalist society versus a communist society, those sorts of things are going to shape us very significantly. How does our culture think about and determine status? What are the legal codes? How does family shape this? What rites of passage do we celebrate? Do we go through together? What language do we speak? There's nonverbal sorts of communications in terms of gestures and facial expressions, and how different cultures use touch. In some cultures, that's sort of a forbidden thing, and in some cultures, it's very acceptable. Personal space, some of those sorts of things, the visual arts, food. There's all sorts of ways in which we can observe culture, sort of from a distance, and take in parts of another person's culture. Along with that, though, is realizing that there is a deeper level of culture that goes on as well, and this is called implicit culture. We don't observe it quite as well, but it speaks to what that culture values the most. How do you know what ideal behavior is within a particular culture? I mean, we can see how people act, but what does a particular culture consider ideal action or behavior? How are people supposed to act in certain situations? You have to dig in deeper into culture in order to see how those things are happening, because it gets into how people tick on the inside, and how culture influences us sort of from the inside out. We might think about this in terms of time, space sorts of factors, how people value those and recognize those. How do people assign meaning to life? Lots of those sorts of things emerge from within the cultural context as well. And so, simply saying, as we wrap up sort of this first PowerPoint, that there's lots going on when we talk about culture. And if you stop to think about your own different cultures that you're a part of, I mean, there's probably a hometown culture. There's a family culture. I mean, if you've been a part of other institutions, probably a particular culture, here at Gardner-Webb, in your high school. If you've been a part of other institutions or organizations, churches have their own unique cultures. Teams have their own unique culture. If you were part of a drama club, a band, a chorus, whatever the case may be, all of these little subgroups have their own unique cultures in which certain behaviors are encouraged, certain things are discouraged. We sort of learn along the way, we adjust, trial and error, those sorts of things. It's happening all the time as we continue to meet people and try to fit into new situations. And one day you'll leave Gardner-Webb and you'll move somewhere else, and there'll be a job that you get, and there'll be a new culture. You'll have a boss who will want a certain ethos, a certain culture in place there, and things that we're always learning, always adjusting, trying to fit in to the world around us, because we want to. I mean, most of us anyway, at some level, we want to fit in and be a contributing member of these groups that we're a part of. And to do that, we have to learn how to make these cultural adjustments, so that we can be meaningful contributors, if you will. Well, the second PowerPoint about culture sort of takes us a little bit of a different direction, sort of more technically into the field, into the field of anthropology. And so, while Gardner-Webb does not have a full-blown course on anthropology, I feel like for this particular course, there are a couple of things that we need to say about anthropology because of how it shapes some of the ways that we will study other cultures in this particular class. Because a lot of what we do will be looking at other cultures, culture in India, for example. Okay, we'll be looking at religion. Well, how does Hinduism shape the culture? How does the Indian culture shape religion, back and forth? And that's getting into anthropology and some of those sorts of things. It's a part of that process as well. So if you go to this PowerPoint and sort of the first full content slide, as we get into the discipline of anthropology, thinking about the word anthropology, we're thinking about a couple of Greek words, anthropos and logos. So that anthropos means man, or mankind, or humankind. Logos means word, or reason, or knowledge. Word man. If we combine them together, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So what we end up with typically is the study of humanity, the study of humankind, which is really broad as we think about anthropology, which is why then we get into very quickly subfields of anthropology, because the study of humankind is so vast. So the number one, here we've got physical anthropology, which is interested in sort of the biology, the physiology, the changes over time. And this gets us into some of the harder sciences, if you will. How have people changed over millennia? What does that look like in terms of biology, and how does that shape the study of humankind? Lots of connection with the study of evolution at this point is what we're getting into. The second subfield of anthropology is called archaeology. 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 I'll try not to have to spell it on the exam. Look it up. Maybe you're a little better of a speller than I am. Archaeology studies human cultures through sort of the process of recovering ancient cultures. At some level, it involves unearthing old cultures, digging, finding old things. Whether we're digging through pyramids in Egypt and making new discoveries, whether we're digging through the dirt and find an old rusty spoon, or whatever the case may be. These sorts of material remains tell us important things about cultures that have gone before. And I guess the thought is that if we can understand how they lived, maybe why people lived in certain ways, then we can understand more about them, about us, about their culture, about how they interacted with other people, all these sorts of things that archaeologists want to learn about. And so these are folks who are dirt diggers and love to find bones and old artifacts and those sorts of things because of what they reveal to us about other cultures. The third type of anthropology is called linguistic anthropology. Linguistic anthropology, which as its name would suggest, gets into the study of languages, how languages have developed over time, what that tells us about people and groups and cultures and those sorts of things. The fourth type is called cultural anthropology. And this is the one, probably more than any other of the subfields, that's going to impact our class. Cultural anthropology is the study of contemporary societies around the world. This discipline has not been around for a real long time, going back to the 1800s. There were several people. One major figure, his name was Franz Boas. His name is here on the PowerPoint. a British guy who began thinking about new ways of studying and thinking about people in other cultures. The practice for a long period of time had been to, sort of look down on people of other cultures, people that we don't know anything about, and making assumptions and those sorts of things. And Boas wanted, sort of from a scientific perspective, for the one who's doing the study to step back a little bit and to observe without bringing in a whole lot of judgment to the table. And so he began the practice of what he called participant observation. And he really believed that the only way that you can really learn about a people and a culture is to go and live with them. You have to learn their language to understand a culture. Language is instrumental to understanding other people and other cultures. You have to live with them. You have to sleep where they sleep and eat what they eat and do the things that they do and immerse yourself in the culture so that you are participating while observing at the same time. Boas was one of the first to talk about cultural relativism, basically saying every culture needs to be understood on its own terms. We can't prejudge other cultures. Back to what we talked about last week, it's not a matter of, oh, this culture's good, this culture's bad, but every culture is different. Being able to recognize those sorts of things, understanding in its own context that it developed in a very different way perhaps than our own culture did, that doesn't make it better or worse. It simply makes it different, and it makes it worth studying so that we can understand it better. So different is a key word for Boas and for cultural anthropology, for participant observation, to really immerse yourself in the culture as much as possible. And we'll see how that works itself out in other ways as we move along through the semester. The fifth subdiscipline of anthropology is applied anthropology. Basically, this is the one that, as we gather information, this can help us solve problems. Why are there particular issues in this culture? Well, as we step back and study, we see that these sorts of things are going on. People are dying at a rapid rate in this culture. There's a high rate of maternal death in the birthing process. Why is that the case? Well, we step back, we study, we look, and based on our findings, we form opinions about maybe what's going on and how to help resolve problems and issues. Is sort of what's up in that subdiscipline. Well, the other thing that I want us to do, sort of the last thing, I guess, is to throw out a couple of other cultural terms that I think will be important as we think through the semester together. Some key cultural terms, things that we may use that will be helpful to know and to be able to distinguish. I think there are 5 of these here between these 2 slides, and we'll wrap up at that point. The first of these words is ethnocentrism. I don't know if this is a word that you're familiar with or not. This is sort of an unhealthy view that tends to say, the person who holds this view would tend to say that my culture is superior and any other culture just is inadequate. It's unreliable, it's unhealthy, maybe it's backward, it's dumb, it's those sorts of things. Ethnocentrism is what we want to move away from. I think it's okay to be proud of your own culture, to love your culture. But I think we can do that without looking down on people of other cultures. We can be grateful for what we've received, for what we have, but yet look at people in other cultures through lenses of understanding that doesn't require us to look down on people or to speak negatively of people in other communities, other cultures, simply because their culture is different from our own. A second term worth mentioning is this term worldview. Worldview is I'm not sure if this is exactly the way that I would put it now. I guess it's the overall perspective from which one sees and understands the world. All of us have a worldview. All of us have a perspective, lenses, if you will, through which we see the world. And worldview usually is concerned about sort of the big questions of life. So your worldview will be shaped by how you answer questions like, is there a God? Where do we come from? Are people good or are people evil? And how does that happen that maybe some are good and some are evil? And what's the meaning of life? What happens to us when we die? These sorts of large questions, and that people are always asking. People from every culture are asking these sorts of questions. And I think how we begin to answer those questions frames up in some way how we see and view the world around us. And I mean, a great example of this is sort of this last question of what happens to us when we die. If your worldview is shaped by the idea that when we die we are reborn into another life, that's going to shape how you view the world, how you act and respond in different circumstances. If it's sort of the cultural religious belief of where you grew up, that we just sort of have this infinite cycle of lives as we sort of work our way through the karmic system, that's going to shape how you think, how you live, how you act, all those sorts of things. In contrast, if your worldview says you get one life, this is it, and maybe even there's nothing beyond this life, then that's going to shape how you live and act and interact with other people and what you do with your life. And if there is some sort of reward system tied up into that as well, that's going to have an impact as well if we start entering in factors like heaven and hell. And so how we answer these questions does, in fact, shape very significantly the types of people that we are, and the people that we become. Well, our last slide for today. Thank you for your patience, if you're even still watching. Another key cultural term is the term values. Sort of one of these. I guess it's a little bit of a generic term. We can talk about values and not be very concrete. When we talk about values, we're thinking about desired behavior, ideal behavior of people in a particular culture. So these are sort of that implicit layer of culture that we talked about a little bit earlier. These are things that you don't necessarily see very easily, but these sort of get embedded into people. As I have here on the PowerPoint, these are well-known assumptions typically shared by people in a society. How do we learn these? And sometimes we pick them up in school. Sometimes we pick them up in family. There's sort of these broad cultural teachings that we pick up along the way. That tells us, sort of what the desired expectation is to be a good member of this particular culture or this particular subgroup. So we can think about American values and things like honesty, for example. But even within subgroups that we are a part of, subcultures that we are a part of, those sorts of values, expected sorts of behaviors are strongly encouraged. Sometimes they're strongly encouraged through legal code, through laws that are passed, and we learn very quickly what those are. But sometimes they are just sort of inherent within cultures as well. How to act in certain situations. So those sorts of things are are very important. Norms, by contrast, are sort of the way that people act. Values are sort of the ideal. Norms are what people are actually doing, how people are typically behaving as members of a particular culture. We can we can talk about, perhaps a value that can be maybe quantified in some way would be a value of unity in some sense. As people of a shared United States, we want to be a unified people. Well, the norm is that we don't live and act very unified. We're quite a divisive lot, and while we may still say whatever, one nation under God, for the vast majority of people, that sense of oneness is a little bit hard to get a handle on because of the divisiveness that exists within our country. So norms talk about sort of typical behavior, how most people are acting in given situations, not the ideal, but what do we settle for, and what's okay. And the last word that I've got on here in terms of cultural terms is the word taboo. Taboos are the forbidden things, the prohibited things. They may relate to people, things that you can say or not say to a certain person. So these are prohibitions applied to things, persons, actions, because they are considered dangerous or socially forbidden. Taboos come in a variety of different shapes and sizes. There are lots of cultures who have taboos around food, things that you cannot eat in certain cultures, because it's either socially, there is a reason why, there's a story behind why we don't eat certain things. Maybe it's considered dangerous in this part of the world that we can't eat this because it will literally kill you. And so these are things that you learn as you are part of a culture. What can you eat? What can you not eat? And it's more than just personal preference, but it's I mean, it's meat in some societies, it's pork in other societies, in those cultures where those sorts of things, either socially, religiously, they've got such importance. For example, the cow in India, that those just become socially forbidden to participate in, or they might have deeper meanings in some other ways as well. There are often taboos around sacred space, religious temples, or sacred spaces. You can't do certain things in these places because of ritual, because of the significance of where you are. Sometimes this carries over into gender roles in certain cultures, that it's just socially forbidden for women to participate in certain ways. And we certainly see that in a number of cultures around the world, that are predominantly patriarchal cultures, male-dominated cultures, which tend to suppress the rights of women. There are such things as matriarchal cultures, where women are the leaders and dominant. Those are few and far between in comparison to patriarchal cultures. But patriarchal cultures tend to rigidly define gender roles, specifically what women can do, what they cannot do, acceptable behaviors. And we'll see some of this specifically when we talk about Islam and the Middle East. It's why there's stories in the news now about women in Saudi Arabia finally getting the right to drive just within the last year. That had been forbidden for a long period of time. And so now that barrier has been broken down, what are the implications of that, those sorts of things. So learning in particular cultures, what you can wear, what you can't wear. Can you do this? Can you not do this? There are all sorts of things for us to learn as we think about other cultures. And so we'll be trying to keep some of those things in mind as we move forward this semester, as we look at sort of that interplay between culture and religion that we will see a lot of this semester. I'm sure that you'll pick up on some of that in your reading as we begin to pick up steam and get into the textbook. Starting on Monday, by the way, for Monday, we'll be sort of doing our exploratory stuff related to the study of religion. There is an slightly updated syllabus that's available to you on Blackboard. So we'll be getting into the study of religion. I think the first chapter in your textbook talks about these sorts of things. You will want to read those in preparation for a possible quiz when we get together in class on Monday. We'll also want to put together some sort of seating chart on Monday so that faces and names, I can start working on those a little bit better. Of course, actually being together physically will help that process as well. Hopefully the snowpocalypse is over, and I think we're all supposed to be in shorts or something by this weekend when it's close to 70 degrees. So that's a little crazy to think about while looking at the snow outside right now. So anyway, thanks if you've made it this far. Thanks for listening and for working through the PowerPoint. The PowerPoints will be the main thing that I'll be looking at when it comes to exam time. So I'll be taking multiple questions from every PowerPoint that we use throughout the semester, and so you'll want to engage those as much as possible. And I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. If you've got questions, feel free to shoot me an email or something along the way. If I can help, I'll certainly be glad to do so. Look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.